Hey folks, how are you? You have to let me know if this is working or not. Um, you're our guinea pigs before we put Scott Peters on the stream. But it's good to see everyone again. I haven't done one of these streams in God knows how long. Gosh, was it the Kilmer stream? I don't know. Jeremiah, you might know if it was the Kilmer stream. But yeah, we did a couple of these like 2 years ago, and then we kind of took a hiatus on them. So it's good to be back. Good to see everyone. And we're doing a different theme this time, which is we're streaming and we're talking about policy, obviously. But we are also, remember, no, Jeremiah, I remember when we were doing these daily at the beginning of COVID. But then we did less of them, and then we brought them back for members, and then we changed it up a lot. But I think they're fun. They're just a lot of work. And we do them late at night when we don't, after a day of work. So it's like, do you want to work and then come back to work and do these again? Because we don't have the studio at home. Anyway, yeah, we haven't done these in like 2 or so years. So it's good to be back. Shout out to Tobin, who was instrumental in getting this fantastic setup done. I'm actually in his office. That's his Polis sign. I unfortunately do not have a Polis sign in my office. And for those who have attended an NLAS, you will recognize that's the big LED globe. And our speaker podium sign. So, next half hour, we're going to be talking to chat, getting things going, make sure all the kinks are smoothed out. If you are joining us from like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or YouTube, if you want to ask questions, you got to do it on Twitch just because we can't monitor like 17 different channels at once. But I will be talking to chat until then. 38 months. Can't believe we've shitposted into our way into the halls of Congress. Look, I don't know the exact amount, but so far as part of this fundraiser for Representative Scott Peters, we have raised a couple $1,000s to support his candidacy. And we think this is super important. Not a lot of organizations out there can say that they fundraise for candidates as effectively as us. And what we're saying is basically like, hey, we are a grassroots group, which is great. We are a center-left grassroots group, which there's like none of them except for us. And also we can show that we can support candidates who actually uphold our values. And like, let's be real here. It's Washington, D.C. It's politics. Quality of policies matter, but it also matters to show that there is fundraising prowess and real people behind those ideas as well. So I'm super proud of the community for doing what they have to support Peters. I know a bunch of people here at CNL and PPI and New Democracy pitched in. So it's been a team effort, but I think it's been a really, really fantastic fundraising drive, and it's not over yet. The bot knew that I was talking about it. If people are interested in supporting Scott Peters, we'll have the link to support him kind of going through the stream every once in a while. Again, that's going to be on the Twitch chat. If you're tuning in from Twitter, it's going to be there. It's going to be secure.actblue.com/donate/042-424 New Liberals. So if you are joining from Twitter, hopefully that helps. I think we've also tweeted the link. So we'd encourage people to support his candidacy because there's a lot of really great members of Congress. But Peters has really been special in the work that he's done on basically all of our core issues, whether it's housing, whether it's permitting reform, whether it's climate, whether it's transportation. He's someone who is like the prototypical new liberal, and we need more of him in Congress. And we need people like him to be effective leaders for as long as possible as well. Yeah, thank you, Pseudo1776, and thanks for joining. But yeah, past couple of months have been absolutely insane here at CNL. So if you're following closely along, we announced that our annual conference is coming back this June. NLAS makes its third edition, though if you're a real OG, you'll remember that the first edition of NLAS was actually called New Directions. And then we changed that name because I don't even remember what the like subtitle was, but it was like New Directions for Democrats, and then like 17 other words following it, and it was a mouthful. So we got a nice snappy acronym, and that has been our tagline for now the past 2 conferences. But if you are in the CNL community, we highly, highly encourage you to attend. It is a very fun-filled 2.5 days of policy programming, meetings with members of Congress, meeting other politicos in Washington, meeting your fellow New Liberals. And also, I would not be describing NLAS, honestly, if I didn't mention the fact that we do host amazing receptions during it as well. So if you want to go to a reception and have a couple of beers with your CNL members or CNL friends that you've known for quite some time but maybe not met in person, NLAS is the time to do it. You can come for free, obviously, especially if you're in DC. But if you're outside in DC and you would like to attend, we do offer limited travel and accommodation scholarships. So if you want like a super duper free trip to DC, you should consider coming. It's always going to be NeoLibCon. Just playing around with the Google Meet and making sure that we're all good to go in time for the stream. Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons we didn't call it NeoLibCon. Where was I? Where something was called LibCon, and I got a kick out of it. I was actually, so this is kind of a fun story. I was in Tbilisi. Georgia, this past week to attend a Liberty conference with Students for Liberty. Really focused a lot on like European liberty and Ukraine and Russia and Europe. And Tbilisi, Georgia was, but by the way, I assume if you're joining the stream, you know, but Tbilisi, Georgia, different country, straddling Asia and Europe, is the most, what's the best word? I don't want to call it new liberal because I don't think that's an accurate term at all. It is the most like desiring to be part of the global community country I've ever been to. So you walk around. So first of all, Georgia's currently in the middle of these massive protests because of a foreign agent law that they're trying to pass. And the foreign agent law is basically saying that if your organization receives over 20% of its funding from out of the country, you have to register with the government. This is bad for a lot of reasons. First of all, they're taking this law as inspiration from Russia. Russia passed this law about a decade ago. Same thing. And the you don't register organizations and do nothing. The product of registration is that if you are an authoritarian government or a government that wants to stifle free speech, you get organizations that might not be saying nice things about the government to register and then use that registration to harass them and delegitimize them. So Georgians, because they saw the Russian playbook, know that this isn't like we're just going to know about who's getting funded from abroad. They know that this will be an opportunity to delegitimize, words are hard. It will be a way to make it harder for organizations that observe democratic elections, that promote freedom, that conduct and supervise human rights in the country to continue to exist. So there have been street protests for about the past week outside of the parliament in Tbilisi. And mind you, Georgia is a country of 4 million people. It's really, really small. And easily you were getting 0.1% of the population out there protesting this stuff. 4,000 people marching, protesting, incredibly peaceful from what I could see, demanding that this law be shelved, because this is actually the second time it's been introduced and the second time there's been protests against it. And the protesters are not just out there saying like get rid of this law, they're out there waving NATO flags. They're out there waving EU flags. They're out there waving American flags because this country, even though it's like Asia and Europe and it's so far removed from what we understand to be the West, has such a Western culture in many ways, such a Western identity, that like walking through, you would think that like you were maybe in Eastern Europe, when in fact you're pretty far removed from Eastern Europe. It's such an interesting place in the world, and I highly recommend anyone who's able to get to that country to visit it. It's gorgeous, the food is amazing, the people are wonderful, but it is like such a different political moment in that country compared to what we see. Like protests in America, like obviously we've seen some like incredibly monumental and important protests in America. We've also seen a lot of silly ones and a lot of bad ones, like notably in DC, like the last big protest in DC, I mean, I don't think maybe not the largest one, but pretty close to it, was maybe January 6th. And like people in Georgia mobilized to like say like, oh, we want to join NATO. Like, we want to be part of the EU. We want to have closer ties to America. So just, like, incredibly patriotic and, like, really reaffirming of, like, the values that America upholds. Not always perfectly, but the values that America tries to uphold when I was there. Let's see. WHDC 425 says, do you think that the Eastern Bloc is so new liberal because of the threats to authoritarianism, cronyism, and the legacy of communism? I think that's basically correct. I wouldn't really describe it as new liberal because a lot of these countries are still very socially conservative. They still have economic policies that I wouldn't describe as like super innovation friendly. But, like, it is, like, the countries do want more freedom. They don't want to be under the foot of Russia. They don't want to be under the foot of China. Like, they want to be able to chart their own destiny. And, like, that's interpreted differently through the cultures of these countries. But it is really reaffirming to see because, I mean, it's just, I imagine it's the first step in a much longer political revolution. The other thing I will say is... the ruling party is really interesting in Georgia. The ruling party is called Georgia Dream. They're a nominally centrist party that like seems to do a little bit of everything. So like years ago, they actually put into the Constitution that like a priority of Georgian government was to like get EU and NATO ascension. Like that's like in the Constitution, it just says, hey, government's got to make sure this is a priority. It's that important to them. But then at the same time, the same government with the new leaders has pushed to create closer ties to Russia. And like I think that's for a couple of reasons. Like one, the Ukraine war actually didn't make them more anti-Russia. It, I think, made them more scared of Russia. Because Georgia, if you're not familiar, was invaded by Russia in 2008. Or 2011, one of those years. I'm mixing them up, I'm sorry. And 40% of the country, roughly, is currently occupied by Russia. There's 2 breakaway regions. It's a really complicated history that I won't get into. But those areas of the country are effectively not part of the government. They are not governed by the Georgian government. And their budget and their security and a lot of their administrative resources come from Russia. So effectively, 40% of the country is occupied by Russia. And the country is oscillating between, like, we want to be part of the West, and also, like, hey, Russia could come in and conquer our country in a heartbeat, so we can't piss them off too much. So what Georgia Dream has done is, like, said we want to be part of the EU, we want to be part of NATO, but also, like, we're not going to criticize Russia too heavily. And, like, this is, like, almost a terrible thing to say, but it's, like, you almost have to be somewhat sympathetic to that position because they're, like, it's so easy as an American to say, how dare a small country, like capitulate to Russia? But then you're there, and you're in the capital, and the capital is, like, 25 miles from South Ossetia, which is one of the breakaway regions, and probably 100 miles from, like, the actual Russian border. And you're like, I get why you wouldn't want to piss them off too much, because if the government came out and said Russia is a fascist government and we're going to invade South Ossetia and take back the land that is ours, like Russia, if they wanted to, could come in and steamroll the country. So, I mean, obviously the young people in Georgia have said, like, we reject this view and we just want to be part of the West and we don't want to capitulate with Russia. But at the same time, like, it is a not unpopular view within the country to say, like, pump the brakes, we got to be somewhat friendly with Russia. And it's just, it's such a terrible situation because at the end of the day, it's really on the West for not embracing a place like that. And if the EU and NATO decades ago had embraced Georgia and helped them ascend to NATO and the EU, Russia wouldn't be messing with the country. They wouldn't have the resources. They wouldn't be able to. But now they're in this position where 40% of the country is occupied. That complicates NATO ascension. The Ukraine war is demonstrating that Russia is even more ballsy when it comes to invading neighboring countries that were part of the former USSR. And it's just the most politically interesting place I've ever been to. And I feel for the people there, and I admire the political culture and the young people there for just like how nakedly pro-West they are. And just cross my fingers nothing terrible happens, because it really does seem like they're on the precipice of big change in either a positive or negative direction. Will there be a possibility of a Georgian NATO application in the near future? So they've applied, I believe. Back in 2008, they applied, and France and Germany actually blocked their application, saying that we didn't want to poke the Russian bear, essentially. Funnily enough, that ended up backfiring because it was Georgia and Ukraine in 2008 that were trying to ascend to NATO, and Germany and France were like, no, we can't let those two countries because it'll piss off Russia. Well, look how that played out. But their intention is still to ascend to NATO. And I do think NATO wants them to ascend, but obviously it is an incredibly complicated matter because technically in the NATO bylaws or constitution, I don't know what the name of the document is, you can't have part of your country occupied when you ascend to NATO. So there would have to be some determination of the status of South Ossetia and the other breakaway region. I know the name of it. I just can't pronounce it. I don't want to butcher it. Before they were to ascend. So it just makes the entire process more complicated. I believe EU ascension is more easy. Like there's no like barrier technically, other than the fact that EU ascension, like for whatever reason, takes like 2 decades because it's the EU. Of course, it has to be a bureaucratic nightmare. They won't shoot protesters because there's an election coming. Yeah, I was also trying to read like why they reintroduced this law, and like nobody had a good theory. They were like, why'd they do this so close to the election? And everyone was like, I don't know. So there was like a lot of like not conspiratorial speculation, but like speculation of like, was Russia putting pressure on them and they like had no choice but to reintroduce this, because why would you be reintroduced just so close to the election? But they do have an election coming up. Eastern Europe has a ton of potential if Russia will ever just chill out. It does, and a place like Georgia has really, really done well in the past decade. Tons of economic growth, tons of gains and happiness. And I think will continue to grow, especially if Russia is able to back off. They're more embraced by the West and can do their own thing because they've become kind of like a tech nomad hub. Cost of living is really cheap there. It's a really like tech-friendly country. Like I had no issues like connecting to my phone or like using my computer there. So like if you're European and you want to like go to a cheap place to work for a couple months because you're a remote worker, like Georgia's perfect. Pseudo 1776. I also read an article that part of the concern with Eastern European countries was that they needed more democratic institutions to prevent another Hungary situation. Yeah, that does seem like that's part of the Georgian thing also, is like they're a democracy, but like they're a former USSR democracy, so like they're still working through their problems of being that kind of a democracy. Anyway, that was my 25 minutes on Georgia because it was the most interesting place I've ever been. I am going to take a quick break and get Scott ready, and then I'll hop back and chat. So we'll be going live with Scott at 8 o'clock. Stand by. Thanks, everyone. Wonderful. Representative Scott Peters, how are you?
I'm great, Colin. How you doing?
Good. I'm going to give 2 seconds just to make sure the audio is all sounding
All
good.
right.
If anyone in the chat can just say if you can hear Scott and you can hear me and nothing's frozen and we're good to go, we're good to go. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It's good to see you again. I think you were our inaugural guest when we first did this like 2 years ago. You've joined us for conferences, you joined us for podcasts
Right.
since. So it's always good to have you as a card carrying member of the organization and all the work that you do.
Love your stuff. I love your stuff.
Um, so first off, I just want to give you an opportunity. This is a new thing that we're doing. We're doing what I believe to be one of the first Twitch fundraisers.
Oh, cool.
So we'll give you an opportunity just to kind of talk about that before we jump into the policy questions.
Well, first of all, I appreciate the support of everyone who can make a contribution to the campaign. I think we think alike, and we have a lot of people to convince to come our way in terms of things like, deregulating for housing, deregulating to build more clean energy, and today. And I think what you're doing is showing support for that when you help me out, and I will try to make sure that we carry the flag and see if we can't get more friends on this journey. So I really appreciate the help. And we run a campaign every time. We structure it like an internship, so young people can get a sense of what a campaign's like. We have speakers come in, the mayor will come in, people will talk about campaigns, they'll talk about government, they'll talk about polling and tactics, and so everyone gets a really good experience out of it. They learn something, and if we're lucky and we're not too challenged, we can help some other candidates who might have closer races, like Mike Levin last time, and we had a really good win in the city council in San Diego. We had a pro housing candidate beat a super NIMBY young person, and it really sent a good message. And so that's the kind of thing we do with our campaign, and appreciate all the support.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, and like I said, you've done a lot of really good work in Congress, so it's the least we can do to give back and show our support for all the work that you're doing on some of the policies that we're going to talk about today. So just quickly before we start, we got some questions that we have for Representative Peters, and then if people have questions, we highly encourage you to drop them into the chat, and we'll have a short Q&A at the end. If you are joining on a platform that is not Twitch, you can only ask questions on Twitch. So hop onto the Twitch to ask any questions, because we're not checking the Twitter chat or anything like that. So first off, I want to talk about permitting reform, a topic that we have talked to you about many, many times.
Yeah.
You've recently introduced the Big Wires bill with Senator Hickenlooper, another good friend of ours.
Yeah.
Can you explain, like I'm a kindergartner, or okay, maybe that's too basic. Like I'm an eighth grader.
Eighth
what
grader.
The Big Wires Act is, why it's important, and why transmission is something that we're even talking about as a high-profile policy.
So step back a little bit, Colin, and talk about why transmission is important. Princeton did some research. Well, it's because you think about building utility scale solar, you think about building offshore wind, and all these things. It doesn't take a lot of imagination to know you need a wire to hook them up to get the power to where it needs to go. You build a ton of solar in Arizona, where there's plenty of sun, you need wires to get it to Detroit where people need it. So we have to build a lot of transmission. In fact, Princeton did Jesse Jenkins at Princeton did research showing that if we don't basically triple the capacity of the existing grid, which it took 150 years to build, we could lose up to 80% of the climate benefit of the IRA, the big climate investment bill that we passed with President Biden last term. Because if you don't have a place to put the electrons, you can catch them all. You can catch solar, you can catch wind, but it doesn't really do any good. So we have to build more transmission. There's sort of three challenges. One is siting. Where do you put the lines? People hate the lines. And in fact, there's been so much resistance to placing lines that now it takes an average of 10 years, or it takes 10 years roughly, to build a high voltage interregional transmission line. 3 years there's 7 years of that 10 years is permitting, is process, right? So what that means is that we've failed to build transmission. We failed to build it in a massive way. So since 2014, just as a frame of reference, North America has built about 7 gigawatts of interregional transmission. You can talk about a gigawatt is later, but just use that as a frame of reference. 7 for North America, a little less than half of that in the United States. In South America, they built 22 in the same time period. In Europe, 44. And in China, 260 gigawatts of interregional transmission. We're way behind. So we have to figure out ways to site these things a lot faster. And then we have to figure out how we're going to pay for them. Because, shoot, I got a landline. My landline's going off. How old school is that? And that never happens. So we have to figure out how to pay for them. Like how do you allocate the costs? Which is a big fight because you got some utilities like Southern companies in the Southeast that have built huge generation. They want to recover it. It's to their economic advantage to keep a monopoly. They don't want to, they want to pay for so-called California's big investments in what they think are more expensive investments in alternative energy. And then you have to do something about reliability. We know that connecting the grid across the country would provide a lot of reliability, because when you have events like we had in Texas, where they had that cold snap and people died because they ran out of power, part of the problem was they couldn't import. They don't have connections outside the region to take excess power and move it. Same thing in the Southeast. Around Christmas time a few years ago, we had a lot of brownouts. In California, we have brownouts. It's a better functioning grid nationally if we can connect everybody. The Big Wires Act would require each region to be able to transfer. The numbers are different, but 15 to 30% of their power outside the region if they needed to. The other advantage of that, by the way, Colin, is it provides cost competitiveness, which is great for consumers, not great for all the utilities who, again, profess to be capitalists but are really regulated and don't necessarily love it. And to be fair, they've made big investments hoping to recoup those, but that's part of the challenge too. So the Big Wires Act would require regions to be able to do that. It doesn't say how to do it, but it says you got to be able to do it, and that would also force the construction of more transmission in general. Does that make sense?
That does make sense, yeah. And I feel like it's just one of the parts of like I think people understand at this point that the importance of permitting. And
right.
They understand the importance of clean energy, but I feel like people really haven't understood the importance of transmission as part of that, because it's just something that you don't think about, but like it's an integral part of our clean energy transmission. And I really like the messaging that came out of like, we're spending billions upon billions of dollars as part of the IRA, and all of that money is going to go to waste if we can't do transmission and permitting reform as part of that. Like it's just going to be money misspent.
And by the way, the bipartisan infrastructure bill has a lot of stuff in there too that needs to be permitted. It's the same problem. Yeah. And I heard, and someone could check me on this, that when President Obama did the TARP, the relief fund, that they allocated $90 billion to infrastructure, but only built about $30 billion of it because of the permitting challenges. And I don't want to. We think about this IRA as the greatest. I think it is probably the greatest investment commitment to climate action in the history of the world. But if the money sits in the bank and doesn't get used, we really failed. So that's why I think we have to really reckon with permitting, and speed is our enemy right now, more than the lack of money.
So I want to move on to another bill that you've introduced, because you clearly aren't complacent to do just one. Which is streamlining power lines essential to electrical demand and reliability act. Obviously, that was a congressional bill. It's just called the Speed and Reliability Act. Likewise,
that's a good acronym, by the way. That's a good. Some of them are silly, but that's a good one. I like that one.
I'm kind of scared to ask the question of how much congressional staff time is used trying to come up with the names to come up with a snazzy acronym for each of them, but I'll leave that one to be a secret.
I think it's after work over drinks when that kind of stuff happens. So I don't think you have to worry about taxpayer funds,
Over at Hawk and Dove, that's where they figure these things out. This is how DC really works. Likewise, would love you just to explain that bill, why it's important to the Big Wires Act, how they're related, and just kind of your work on that.
So one of the players in this whole thing is the Federal Electricity Regulatory Commission, FERC. And it's the federal agency that's supposed to plan for various aspects of electricity in the country. One of the things it's supposed to do is designate these international corridors of interest, right? So it's supposed to do a big study on where power needs to go and where it needs to come from, and it just doesn't happen. So I back in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, before that I had drafted a bill called the Power On Act, which is also a good acronym, but I have no idea what it stands for anymore. But the idea was, if the states couldn't agree on one of these national lines of importance, then the FERC would be authorized after a year to come in and draw the lines. And so, and that really hasn't. The problem is none of this has resulted in any of these lines actually getting built. So what we realized is that there's also a number of sort of entrepreneurs out there who are kind of merchant builders. And what they do is they go find power generation, they go find customers, and they respond to the market and lay out kind of where the line needs to go based on market conditions, right? Well, gosh, that seems like a better way to feed the economy than for waiting for a regulatory agency to do it, and the one that might not be so motivated to make people mad anyway. So what we did was we said, okay, well, under the SPEED Act, we'll let that person draw the line, and then we can adopt that as the designated corridor for the national interest. And that would get us potentially a map that would be a lot more responsive to market conditions and what's real. So it would allow the transmission lines, whether they're proposed by utilities, merchant developers, other entities that want to build transmission, they could propose their line to DOE and FERC to be designated. They're just the high voltage, high impact lines that cross multiple states. Again, a way to sort of jump over the existing process to get us a map of lines that could be in the national interest. And again, Senator Hickenlooper's on that bill in the Senate as well.
Love it. So I think I understood that. Basically, currently the government sets where these lines go, but that's probably not efficient for a lot of reasons. And what you're proposing is that power companies help decide where those lines get set. The government says, great, you guys probably know better than us, so we're going to do that.
Well, and actually the government has the power to do it. We're just not doing it. And we've had this structure for a long time. We're just not getting, as I said, at the beginning, our record at building interregional transmission is really woeful. So we're just not getting it done. Yeah. And it's not just utilities. It's also these kind of intermediaries, these merchants who figure out where to match up customers with power generation. In fact, sometimes they're not actually aligned with utilities because utilities may not want the incursion of competition in. But again, all the better to get the market to tell us where these things need to be, because I don't think the government's that's just not what we do.
So using both of these bills, I want to jump in and ask about your work on hydrogen and nuclear power. Why, I think we're talking about why transmission is important for clean energy. Why is it specifically important for stuff like hydrogen energy and nuclear energy?
Well, first of all, thank goodness nuclear energy is people are realizing that it's non-emitting, it's baseload power.
It's having a renaissance.
It's having a little bit of at least a renaissance. It's really expensive to get these small modular reactors going, but I think finally there's a sense that on the left and the right that this is a really good way to proceed. The modular nature of it is also helpful. You don't have to build these huge things like we have just north of my district, the San Onofre Generation Station, or SONGS, which was just decommissioned. We've got buckets loads of nuclear waste that have to be moved at some point. It's safe now, but we're going to need a place to move it. And new technologies, they offer the promise of generating a lot less waste. And I think, being much more modular and able to match up with the need. It's actually pretty important when we think about the load demand that we're going to see. One thing I think is going to really make sure we do build transmission is that we're seeing huge increases in demand for electricity, both from the electrification that's going on right now from the market, from the IRA, from the manufacturing that the Biden administration has brought back home, but also these data centers. I mean, hundreds of megawatts of power for one data center. Imagine you put something like a small a nuclear modular reactor where a coal plant used to be, put a data center next to it. That could be a pretty efficient way to handle that load. So I think nuclear is seeing a little bit of a renaissance. We passed some good bills, bipartisan way to sort of promote that. And now it's about incentivizing the early investments that are always the most expensive and most risky. And then hydrogen can be used to store energy. It can power heavy duty vehicles. There's a lot of concern that batteries might be too heavy for really big trucks. It can power industrial processes to make materials or chemicals. These sectors are really hard to decarbonize. I mean, steel and cement are some of the biggest emitters, and the stuff we really need. So we have a Hydrogen Investment Innovation Act. It's got a pilot program for flexible loans for retrofitted hydrogen infrastructure projects. And again, all this is a permitting challenge. The other thing, I'm going on a little bit, but one thing I'd say about permitting that's also a challenge is we're going to see 30 to 60,000 projects out of the incentives that we put out in the IRA. You just can't put that through the federal funnel we have now. There's just not enough people you can hire in the Department of Energy or the EPA to process this stuff. So I think what we're going to have to head toward is sort of pre-approvals, at least on the NEPA side. And when you do a hydro project, let FERC issue the permit. Don't worry so much about the NEPA process, which sort of adds burden to it. And if we're really serious about this and we're really concerned about the time, we said a few years ago that we had to be on track in 10 years. We're just not going to get there with the current regime.
Yeah, and I'm going to totally misremember what exactly it was, but there was it was one of the Public Lands Administration's BLM says that there's a new categorical exclusion for energy generation on public lands.
Yeah.
Basically
Hydro.
saying
It's geothermal.
Geothermal, yes.
Yeah. It's great.
Which is so exciting. And I mean,
Yeah.
geothermal is another thing that if we're having the conversation about transmission, I mean,
Right.
geothermal only exists in certain parts. If we want to get the geothermal energy from the remote places in the country where that exists, the places where people live, you need to do transmission built out.
Right. It's so logical. Yeah. By the way, you can't love your electric vehicle if you don't love a lithium mine someplace. And that's like mining in this country. That's pretty old school. I think that's going to be really interesting. But my colleagues in Nevada, they've got a lot of lithium out there. They want to get going, and again, permit reform.
Didn't we discover a bunch of lithium in the United States recently too?
Yes, there's a ton in I think Imperial County in California. There's a lot in Nevada. There might be more.
There was a good joke recently about like the cycle of American rare minerals is always that we always have a freak out every couple of years about how China has all this minerals and we don't, and they're going to overtake us. And then every time we have a freak out, a bunch of investment goes to finding that stuff. And every single time we go looking for it, we find it in the U.S.
Right. Yeah. And the only thing I just say, I hate to step on a joke. It's also the processing. Like a lot of the minerals, like cobalt from Africa gets processed in China. The processing capacity is what we have to have here as well.
Oh, interesting. I didn't even think of that part. Yeah. This is why you're the congressman. You have to think about all of this.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think that's also been notable about your work, but I think it's also a larger thing to talk about the permitting reform discussion, has been bipartisanship in this. Energy has been one of those things that's been pretty good about going across the aisle, but then we've seen moments where it's been very partisan. So could you kind of talk about the bipartisanship of clean energy and permitting reform, or in some cases the lack of bipartisanship on this issue?
Yeah, it's not easy. So first of all, it's logical that there should be bipartisanship because Republicans have always wanted permit reform. They've always wanted businesses to be able to build stuff faster. Now, if you're environmentalist and you want climate action, you think about the energy projects that are in line to be built. I think 85 or 90% of them are non-emitting. So just make everything faster, right? Would you give up 10 to get 90? Of course you would do that. The second time you did that in a casino in Vegas, you'd be kicked out because you would be making too much money, right? So just make everything faster. And that's a little bit hard for people because they want to pretend that there's no natural gas. I mean, for my taste, I don't think we should ever burn another spoonful of coal, but natural gas is going to be around for a while. I get that. We can make it cleaner with better methane regulations and regime. Yeah. I think that's important. But shoot, I mean, if you get 90 clean for 1 emitting or for 10 emitting, you do that. And so that's why I think there should be bipartisanship in concept. Republicans have been suspicious about transmission because they kind of see it, I think some of them wrongly, as a proxy for clean energy competing with oil and gas. And I think that's wrong for a couple of reasons. One is it doesn't matter, what your generation source is, whether it's emitting or not. You still have to have wires. And second, the load growth is going to demand that wherever we are, we build a ton more transmission. So it should be bipartisan. On the left, on the right, by the way, we've had a little bit of progress because, when I came in, there was a significant amount of denialism. And to be fair, there's still some, but there's a lot of, there's 85 Republicans in the House who signed up for the Conservative Climate Caucus. And to sign up for that, you have to acknowledge that climate change is happening and it's driven by human activity. That's a pretty profound shift. I keep telling my friends that, now we have to do something about it, but it's not denial, and that's helpful. On the left, we still have trade-off denial. I mean, it's if you look at the wildfire regulations, gosh, I mean, you every time you want to thin and make a forest more healthy and restore natural fire activity, you're accused of working for the loggers. I mean, we're in this 1970s political battle, right? And then there are people that think that there's going to be a transition that happens overnight and then oil and gas is going to be gone. And that's just not the way it's going to happen. I mean, we call it net zero for a reason. We don't call it zero, we call it net zero. So a lot of it is carbon management and carbon capture. But on the left, people have a hard time with the trade-offs. And particularly when you think about, giving up some process. Nick Bagley at University of Michigan Law School, he did a great podcast with, I think, Ezra Klein, where he talked about Democrats' fetish with process. Yeah, we just love our process, right? And we're just going to have to give that up if we're serious about climate. Mm-hmm. And that's been really difficult for a lot of people. So logically, it should be bipartisan, but there's stickiness on either side.
Yeah, I remember listening to that podcast and just being. When you learn that phenomenon, you see it in so many places, even beyond just permitting reform, that Democrats really just love the process of how we do things rather than about achieving the objective as quickly as possible.
Right.
And I think there is some merit to that, but at the same time, if we're going to all agree as Democrats that climate change is a crisis and we have to deal with it as quickly as possible, there just isn't time for process, even if in an ideal world we want to be doing that. And I also want to just ditto what you said about the right becoming better on climate change. There's a lot of really good organizations in D.C. on the right that I think have done effective work in convincing Republican legislators that it's okay to be anti-climate change, to support clean energy. There's ways as a Republican to talk to your constituents about that and not be seen as some crazy lefty. And it's been reassuring to see over the past even 5 years, but I think 5 to 10 years, a really, really big shift on the right in that regard.
Look what Texas is building. Texas is now the largest wind producer of any region, I think. Yeah. Texas, right? But can I tell you a story about the issues we have on the left that it's an illustrative? If you give me a couple minutes.
Yeah, please do.
So I'm flying back from a congressional trip to the Middle East, led by Chris Coons, and a guy sits down next to me. And he says, his name is Bruce Westerman. He's from Arkansas. He represents Arkansas in the House. I didn't know the guy. Very soft-spoken. It turns out he went to the University of Arkansas, and then he went to the Yale School of Forestry and got his master's in forestry. He knows more about forestry than anybody in Congress. And he said, I want to tell you the story of the sequoias, right? Environmental treasure, 3,000 years old year-old trees, older than Jesus. I mean, magnificent, majestic, 300 feet tall. He says, until 2017, we did not lose a single sequoia to fire because they're built for a fire at the base and actually need fire to open up their seeds. But because we've suppressed fire over the past century, you might have a shade-tolerant tree like a fir tree or a pine tree grow up next to the sequoia. And in 2017, one of those trees conveyed fire up into the canopy of the sequoia, the only place it's vulnerable, killed the sequoia. And he said to me, and this got me, he says, since 2017, we lost 20% of the sequoias the same way. So what do you do about that? He said, the answer is pretty simple. You need two things. One is you have to provide resources to go into each of those 60 or so groves of sequoias and restore the conditions that would have existed had natural fire taken place over the last century. So you'd have to do some thinning and taking out some of those trees that wouldn't have survived natural fires. And he says you can't do a 4-year NEPA survey on every grove. You have to basically provide an exemption for that. And I said, Bruce, it sounds like that makes a lot of sense to me. Let's do it. And I said, I'll do the bill with you. So we did this bill. We had, I won't say their names. We had one very responsible environmental group work with us, help us draft the bill. We had another national one actually endorse the bill. The Redwoods League and all the California environmental groups totally were behind it. The tribe was behind it. Bruce says that, one thing about the tribes is they know how to work with fire. They've always gotten it right. They knew this condition wasn't natural and they supported our bill. But I got this screed from these environmental groups before, like some of them I had said, let me talk about it. Before I even had a chance to talk to them, they wrote to me and they wrote to everybody, said, don't support this Save Our Sequoias bill because of what it's going to do to NEPA. It's a slippery slope. We can't change NEPA. I mean, this is going to, he's going to try to do this with all the forests and, basically this is our bedrock environmental law. It's always a bedrock environmental law. And just hammered me, hammered on my bill. And to the extent that the group that the day before I was going to introduce it with 30 Republican and 30 Democratic co-sponsors, they said they wanted their name off it.
Wow.
And I said, you can't do that. I convinced them to stay on it. But in that Congress where we had the majority, the Democrats had the majority, we couldn't get a hearing in the Natural Resources Committee because the chair was, if the Sierra Club was going to be against it, he was going to be against it.
Wow.
Well, we changed leadership, and lo and behold, the chair of the committee is the Natural Resources Committee now is Bruce Westerman, my friend from the Plain, who calls a hearing on the bill. And I thought we might have 3 Democrats on the whole committee vote for it out of committee. So I knew it was going to get out of committee because they had a Republican majority, and they didn't have a problem with it. But so Bruce very, deftly called 2 of the environmental groups in California that supported it, the Redwoods League, and I can't remember the other one. He called the tribe to come testify. Very important for Democratic lawmakers to hear from the tribes. And then the Democrats called another witness in forestry. And this, I've never seen this happen before. After all the testimony came in, after the hearing, the witness against the bill said, I changed my mind. This is the right thing to do.
Wow.
So it came out of the committee on a voice vote, which means, this is without, calling the roll. So no one had to register a yes or no vote, but it was a unanimous vote, right? And that's what we're facing, right? So we're facing this environmental groups who I believe sincerely care about the environment, but they got to get in the game. It can't be on the sidelines just throwing rocks and treating like NEPA like it's came from Moses on tablets. It's just a bill from 1970, like 54 years ago, right? That was built back then to defend against making mistakes because we were making bad environmental mistakes. All the bill says is before you take a federal action, you have to know what the environmental consequences are. You have to consider the alternatives. maybe mitigate the consequences, which makes sense. But now it's become this gate, and it takes 4 years to do a NEPA thing. You get all this litigation afterward. It's death. And here it is. They're fighting us on what? On the sequoias, the environmental groups.
That's insane.
It's insane. And so I think it's a really good illustration of like the knee-jerk kind of reaction. Now, they're going to come around because there's no argument. There's no like logical argument against why you don't want to make clean energy faster. There's no argument against that. It's just that they just don't know how to swim in that pool. But it's just, the bill was from 1970. It wasn't, it wasn't on tablets. It was from electric typewriters, and, it wasn't Moses. It was just, people no smarter or better looking than us who did this bill, which was right for the times, but has to be adjusted for today.
Yeah, and I think there's really two important points also of just like, one, NEPA was not made in an era that climate change was something that people thought about. And right. It was in the era of like someone's going to build an industrial plant next to a park and pollute the waters. And like in that sense, NEPA makes sense. Like you don't want something like that happening. But in the 50 or so years since NEPA became law, we now have to contend with climate change, and that requires us to build out of it, rather than to block things to prevent it.
We're on offense, not defense.
Yeah,
and that's
exactly.
I think it's not built for offense. And by the way, I just say like this sort of conclusion I get. Oh, NEPA is a bedrock environmental law. It was the first one, but I'd contend that the bedrock environmental laws are the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, which actually prevent the emission of pollutants into the environment that could affect human health without a permit. I mean, that's really where the compliance is. NEPA is a planning document, and we have to make plans in a different way. It's just wrong for the time right now.
Yeah, I think that's completely correct. And I mean, CNL has always been of the same position of you of like, look, environmental laws are good. NEPA in theory is good, but like if you believe that climate change is the threat that everyone says it is, and we need to build more clean energy, you have to get out of the way of NEPA to do this kind of stuff. And it goes even beyond just energy. It goes to infrastructure. It goes to high-speed rail. It goes to building housing. Which is a good segue into our next topic. But I just want to say, I mean, thank you for the work that you've done on permitting reform. There's not that many people screaming from the rooftops about how important it is. It feels like it's gaining in popularity, and people are beginning to recognize how important of an issue it is. But it's still something that's so niche. Yeah, please.
To people out. So the other thing is, I practiced law for 15 years before I went into this. I did environmental law, and I don't think a lot of people recognize what a NEPA lawsuit is and how much time it takes. But the one thing I would just say to everyone who's on this with us is, think of yourself as an educator. Make sure people know that this is in the way that we're all in this climate action thing together. We have unintended consequences from 54 years ago that are getting in our way, and we need to fix those.
Exactly. Well, as I promised, the segue from permitting to housing. You've done so much work on housing as well. I believe the last time we did the stream with you, you said that you founded San Diego YIMBY, where you were one of the people who helped start San Diego YIMBY.
YIMBY Democrats, yeah.
YIMBY Democrats. There we go. Right. Okay. You've advanced a ton of pro-housing bills while you've been in Congress and when you were in San Diego. Can you kind of talk about what currently before Congress? What are the actions that you guys are considering passing in the pro-housing front? What can we expect not only this Congress, though I guess it's wrapping up, but like depending on if we have a Democratic president or a Republican president come January, what are the new bills that we might see on the housing front?
So, I mean, first, I like to bash California a little bit, but just on the federal side, the role of the federal government is a little bit attenuated in housing because we don't really make the decisions about zoning and permit approval, but we can provide a lot of resources. So a couple of things we do provide Section 8 housing vouchers for poor people, which are great, but it helps if they have a place to redeem them, a place that they can live in.
Exactly.
We provide a lot of support for veterans, veterans assisted supportive housing, VASH vouchers. which are really important in San Diego. They vets, a lot of vets do great. Most vets do great, but they also, some of them fall on hard times, and they make up a bigger percentage of our homeless population than other areas. So the VASH vouchers are really important for us. We do something called a low income housing tax credit, which is a way for us to inject money to support rent restricted projects that the market will generate on its own. So we provide a financing supplement to those kinds of projects. And then I probably maybe talked about this last time, but I had the idea about what can we do to leverage other federal investment to encourage better local decision making. And the bill I have is called Build More Housing Near Transit. The administration has adopted some of this. But when I was a young baby council member in early in the last decade, or the 2000s, we started working on an extension of our light rail from downtown up to the job section, the major job center that I represented on the city council near La Jolla. You had to, it's a ton of work. It's a ton of permitting. There's a lot of engineering. You got to figure out the route. But one of the things you have to do is you have to have a local match. So in 2004, we passed a half-cent sales tax extension to support our plan, which has to be by 2/3 in California, which we did by 3,000 votes in the county. So that generated $1 billion we could put toward the project, and it's working its way through. And by the time I out of the city council, I'm out of the Port Commission, which I did next, and then I'm in Congress. Now they're asking for federal money, the federal match, right? And it occurred to me as a Congress member that, hey, no one ever asked me what we were going to build next to this thing, because it turns out that you built this line in the place where there was the least resistance, and it's all along a lot of parking lots. What if we had said, as part of the competition for federal money, what origins and destinations are you going to put on this line? Because if you want federal money, because we want ridership, whether you are you don't give a crap about climate change, you're just a taxpayer advocate. You want fare box recovery. You want people to be in the train if you're going to build it. And if you're an environmentalist, you want people out of their car. But you have to put stuff next to it. And so I said, why don't we make that part of the competition? So you're competing for federal money. When you come to us with your plan, local government, tell us, you're going to put housing near these things. So we worked on this with Up for Growth and some other planning agencies, and came up with a pretty good bill. That's a way we could use federal leverage to get better decisions out of locals. I think also the Biden administration, to their credit, is looking at what incentives they can provide localities to ease up. But look, this is kind of a blue state problem because, Houston didn't put a lot of restrictions on housing, and they don't have the high rents that we do. California, we make it really hard to build housing here. We've done that for 30 years, and now we're paying the price, literally paying the price in really high rents. And it's unsustainable. So you got young people who, we have this booming economy. We have really low unemployment. They want to work here, but it's really expensive to live here. Can you afford a place? And not to mention teachers and firefighters and other people who work, they're coming in from way out yonder because that's all they can afford. So I think, building around transportation makes a lot more sense. Obviously where rents are high, we have homelessness. And so and rents are high where you don't have supply. So it's pretty basic, first year economic stuff. We have to build more housing at all levels, right?
And just today, actually, there was a poll released saying that housing is the third biggest issue for young people.
Right.
Not just for affordability reasons, but I'm sure it's also it just affects where you can live. Like if I want to take a job in New York, or if I want to take a job in San Francisco, I might not be able to, because there's literally not a home for me to live in if I want to go to a place like that. Do you think Democrats ought to make this a bigger issue as part of their campaign to talk to young voters? Because I feel like I don't hear about it as a proportion of other issues that we hear about from Democrats.
Well, I feel like it's coming. I do think politics is changing. If I was talking to a 30-year-old, I'd say, wake up. This is generational warfare. You have to, these older wealthy people are outbidding you and keeping you out, and also robbing you of wealth and opportunity. that you should have. So I do think it's changing. Our YIMBY Democrats are having a bigger and bigger effect. We're winning council races here. I think also there's folks like Scott Wiener in the Senate in California, Buffy Wicks in the Assembly, who are trying to work on this. Frankly, there's a lot of entrenched interest. I think you should just get rid of litigation over housing and infill areas. Just get rid of it. Let the city council do its permitting. And like, if someone wants to develop a coastal wetland, grind them. Like, make it really hard. We don't want to lose those resources. But we treat developing a surface parking lot like it's a sensitive resource, and that's bizarre. It's just bizarre. I did when I was on the council. I did a really cool project in the Bird Rock section of La Jolla. We had a 81 foot wide 6-lane road that went through this part of La Jolla. That on either side of it, you couldn't get a house for less than $2 million. Really, very nice neighborhood, but the road was worn down. I mean, the speeds were high. No businesses could survive because everything was going by so fast. You were scared to open your door if you parked parallel. So the neighborhood said they wanted us to fix it. Of course, when you go talk to them about actually making changes, they're up in arms. We hired a walkability consultant for them. This guy, Dan Burden, was like old hippie guy who wore like a neon vest. And he went around with the neighborhood and talked to them about what they could do. And we put in modern roundabouts, 5 modern roundabouts to slow traffic, convey traffic more efficiently. It made it quieter. Businesses invested. People could eat out on the street. And by the way, we snuck in 138 units of housing where there was an old motel. And, people, they lose their shit over 14 units around here. But because this was really a good development, and it paid for 2 of the roundabouts, the community was behind it, and that's the kind of thing we could do. You gotta just show people that investing in housing, it's not a blight on your neighborhood. It makes your neighborhood better. You have a surface parking lot, that's nothing to look at. How about a nice apartment building with some aesthetics and some maybe some ground floor retail or art studio or something like that. There's stuff you can do to make it work, but we got to get past this notion that building more housing is like a civic enema.
Yeah, especially like you said, when it's going in a parking lot, or it's going next to transit, or it's going along a major road. You're not. It's not going up in the middle of your suburb. It's not taking over grandma's house. And there's a big skyscraper now there. And that's the kind of stuff. I mean, when we go to permitting and go to accelerating that kind of stuff, I mean, that's like the easiest candidate. Like, no one should ever have a reasonable objection to that. And if you do, you're just not acting in good faith.
But I'll tell you, I mean, it's pretty rational though, Colin. I mean, I think people are, it was got to be a joke when you get testimony at the city council and they say, we're for housing, we're just not for it here. And so it was always what you got. But I mean, the thing is, it's not sustainable not to build more housing, and you have to. You can do it in a way that actually makes your neighborhoods better.
So I want to leave enough time for audience questions, but I want to get to one more topic with you because it's something we haven't talked about before, but I think it's super interesting. So last year you were working on a bill to create a bipartisan fiscal commission. Yeah. Would love to hear more about that. Why that was a priority for you. And also, it's not a sexy issue. We were just talking about these grand things like greatly change America. But why should young people and people who care about these issues that we're talking about also care more about fiscal issues that were part of the fiscal commission debate?
It's because it's your money. I mean, I think there's pretty much a consensus now that the level of debt we have is really dangerous for us. And I'm not just talking about sort of the old skin-flinty New England Concord Coalition guys, but like the Paul Krugman, liberal economist, says, it's really gotten out of hand. And down the line, someone's going to pay off that debt. It's probably not going to be me. It's probably going to be you and your kids. But the other thing that's happening right now, which I think is really interesting and politically interesting, is, our trust funds are on the brink of failure. So Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. Social Security, for instance, this is a good example. Will run out. It will start paying out more than it takes in about 9 years. When that happens, there's already a built-in remedy in law. It's across the board cuts, and right now they'd be about 23% cuts. So
Oh wow.
if you're and this, I couldn't believe this when I heard this, but this is true, and AARP doesn't disagree. So whether you're 72 or 92, whether you're rich or poor, you're going to get a 23% cut in your benefits. Now, at the same time, you've got all these groups saying, "Don't touch my Social Security." Well, that's nuts. Your Social Security is in the hospital bed, right? It's got cancer, and you're telling the doctor not to treat it. And I think the assumption is that we'll just throw a bunch of general fund money in there at the end of 9 years, but I don't see how that happens. If people wanted to cut Social Security, let's say Republicans are evil, like you hear in the rhetoric. They want to cut Social Security. You know what they should do? Nothing. Just wait, because every day gives them more leverage, right? Because when you get to the day before, it's going to be a 23% cut. They're going to say, "How's 15% for you?" I mean, if you want to save Social Security, you should save it now. And by the way, we should save it for you. I think most people your age say, "I don't ever expect to get any money in Social Security," yet you're paying these taxes. So I think we got to think about new ways of retirement. The idea that I'm working on right now is if you think about retirement, it's sort of always been three pillars. It's been your savings, your pension, and your Social Security. Well, we don't see pensions anymore, and nobody's savings. I mean, everybody's really concerned about the saving rate. No one's saving. So how about if we've set up a savings plan for everybody, and it would work like this: when you turn 18, we'll give you a minimum wage, and 50 cents of that every hour will go into an account for you. 50 cents an hour for your working life. Now, if I had done that in my retirement age, I'd have about $650,000 in the bank from compounding, right? And people are talking about not being able to pay a $400 expense. You're not going to worry about Social Security if you've got that kind of money. And that's that's a better way to think about this now, given demographics, because demographics are never going to be in the position where Social Security is going to be enough for people. So this one of the things the Fiscal Commission would take on is this kind of thing. The Highway Trust Fund is just about out of money. Medicare is going to see automatic cuts as well. And, for us to be able to respond to emergencies, whether it's a pandemic or a war, we have to have a good balance sheet in our country. And so I think, our budget system now in Congress isn't working. So our idea is a commission of mostly members of Congress and the Senate, both sides of the aisle, and some experts who would work this out and come up with something we could vote on, up or down, no amendments in Congress, and see if we can't fix it. I don't see a better answer, so I think it's got a shot.
And do you think this is something that could come up this Congress, or is this something that you're thinking about in the future, really?
Everybody who bitches about debt and deficit, they got no better answer.
Yeah.
So I think, anytime we do a funding bill, we offer this as a solution. It's the best solution that's out there. And actually, we got it passed out of the Budget Committee this term. So it's ready to go. And so, it could come up again in September. If someone's got a better idea, by the way, or if you know how Congress could get a hold of this, I would. But it's just politically really difficult to fix this problem. And that's why we keep borrowing money. Now we're borrowing money to pay expenses. And I complained about Trump's tax cuts. It was terrible. It was $2 trillion. But that's how much money we're borrowing every year. We're just to pay our expenses, because we're not getting the revenue in to cover the money we're spending.
Yeah, and look, I fully support a fiscal commission. I think it's, like you said, the best way that we can address this issue is a bipartisan members getting together with experts and saying, this is what we're going to present, this is what we came up with, rather than just like having this completely polarized discussion about Social Security cuts, whether they're good or not, which party hates Social Security, and all that. So I'm rooting for that, and I hope that it's one of those things that we can all get together, and also, like you said, touching on Social Security, caring about young people, how this is going to affect us in 30 or 40 years, because right now we're not going to get those benefits. So who's going to be there saying who we're going to get those benefits?
I think this is an area where young people should really, really wake up. I mean, we already spend 6 times as much money on old folks as we do on children. And that's not a future-oriented investment plan.
Yeah. So I want to move to audience questions before we run out of time. I first want to take a question from Salem, who asks like a trade energy question, which I like. Do you think it would be possible to convince Biden and Congress to end tariffs and trade restrictions on clean energy made by our allies, or is that something that the Democratic Party is just not going to be able to get on board with because of its trepidation to touch that issue?
I'm not sure what Salem's referring to specifically, but is this like the solar panel kind of thing?
Perhaps. I mean, there's also been like the LNG export and import restrictions that we've seen. Do you think Democrats are going to be more amenable to doing this kind of stuff, or do you think there's always going to be a hesitation to touch trade when it comes to clean energy?
Well, I'm out of the mainstream because I'm pro-trade. I was for Obama's trade plan, and neither Biden nor Trump love that approach anymore. Two things on trade is, one thing is I think there is a legitimate reason to bring back a lot of supply chain to the United States. I had this fight over solar panels because they wanted to do it overnight. And preventing solar panels from China would have, canceled a lot of solar power. Mm-hmm. And so I fought to, give some time for that to happen. We may need another extension on that. We've got to be pragmatic about it. And I don't know if this addresses Salem question, but the other thing that's happening in trade is also John Curtis, who's a Republican from Utah, and I have a bill called the Prove It Act, which is a border carbon adjustment bill. And the idea is that other countries have prices on carbon, which pretty damn efficient way to work this out. We didn't choose to do that, but I think Canada's over $100, Europe's $80, England's $80. I think more. It's in that range. We don't have that, so they're going to say why shouldn't we adjust for that if we're making these investments and you're not? We are making investments. We just have to figure out a way to account for them. So John and I are coming up with an idea that if we're not going to have a price on carbon, which would be the easy way to meet that, we have to figure out an accounting system that shows what our companies and our government is investing to make sure that it's even and trade is fair. Those are the two things I think I'm coming up on trade, but the supply chain, moving the supply chain and doing it in a way that's pragmatic and pro-climate action, and then figuring out how to deal with other countries that are doing this in a different way.
On the same topic, there's a question from Crushnaut who asks, do you foresee the grid expansion ever connecting with Mexico and Canada to share the unique geographical advantages that Mexico has when it comes to solar and Canada when it comes to hydropower? Or do you think there's never really going to be a future in which we're connecting our grid to those two countries?
It's a great idea. It's a great question. I think I just spoke at the Canadian Embassy about this too. I should have mentioned.
Oh, nice.
They're very interested in it, and I do think that's pretty possible. There's already connections between Alberta and some of the energy generations up there. So yeah, I think that's a real possibility as well.
That's great. Yeah, because I would be worried that'd be one of those things bogged down again in like the trade restrictions agenda. Because I think my understanding is we do get some like hydropower from Canada through Maine and stuff like that. But I could be wrong.
And the Northeast. Hey, listen, it's harder to deal with Texas than it is with Saskatchewan. in this because Texas wants to be really very intentionally by itself.
So I think we're going to take one more question. I'm just going through these. So we have a question from Woody on the question of debt and the fiscal commission. So it says, you're right about debt, but it may be quite hard to get Republicans in the Senate to support tax increases on the rich and reach debt deals. So what can blue states and localities do to address federal debt and inflation? Should the states and localities consider making compacts where they will all raise taxes on the rich and then take on more responsibilities from the federal government?
The problem is we got a federal hole. I mean, I don't know you can avoid that through state action. And you're right. I mean, what happened was when we had the budget committee hearing, AARP and the Committee to Save Social Security and Medicare, which, by the way, does not have a plan to save Social Security and Medicare, they all came to protest this commission because they thought it was going to lead to benefit cuts. As I said before, benefit cuts are already law. And then when Grover Norquist and Newt Gingrich found out about it, they came out against it because they think it's a ploy by Democrats to raise taxes. everybody knows what has to happen here. You're going to have to compromise on both sides in a way to make it sustainable. That's going to involve revenues too. So that's why you got to get people in the room, force them to face facts in a way that Congress doesn't. Because in Congress, face it, you can just blame people, blame the other side for not solving the problem and get reelected.
Mm-hmm.
In a fiscal commission, you actually have to come up with a plan that gets a vote. And then let's see how you vote on it. And then let's see how you explain that.
Well, on that note, Representative Scott Peters, just want to thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a fantastic conversation. I love going off topic for whatever stories or other ideas that you have to share, because they're always interested and aligned with us. So we really appreciate it.
I love what you guys do, and be vocal out there. Let people know, that we can't get where we need to go with this on the same map. So we got to make some changes and be constructive and be assertive and help us out.
Yeah, and I want to remind people as well that we're doing this stream to support Representative Scott Peters' re-election campaign and support all the good work that he's doing. So we highly encourage anyone who's able to and wants to support him. I believe we have the link in the chat. I'll let Tobin re-up that. But just thank you again for your work, and anything that we can ever do to support you, we're always here to support that and amplify it and do what we can to make it possible.
Great. Say hi when you see me on the street. Thanks very much, Colin. Take care.
Have a good night. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, hey, thank you everyone so much for joining. It was always a fun conversation with our friend Scott. And thank you for all the good questions. I feel like that's really underrated as part of these discussions of typically you do these AMAs and people will ask incredibly stupid questions. They won't understand even the concept of the issue. And I think this is the only forum of politics on the internet where we have members of Congress join us, and those members of Congress get questions about connecting the grid to foreign countries and the impacts that might have on trade tariffs. So thank you all for asking good questions. Again, just want to super duper encourage people, if you do and you can support Representative Scott Peters, highly encourage you to do so through the Act Blue link. We just pinned the message in the chat, so it's easy to do so. Look, there's not that many people in Congress who do the work that Scott does that's so aligned with our values, so we want to do what we can to support him. And this is a little way that we can potentially give back to him. So on that note, we're going to wrap up. Hopefully we'll be doing more of these. Don't be shocked if the stream is back in the next month or two. But I do want to remind people again that if you are interested in working and engaging with CNL, that our annual conference is coming up in June. And we highly encourage people to either come for free, because tickets are free, especially if you're in DC. But if you'd like to attend, we do have a number of travel and accommodation scholarships open for application at the moment. So we highly encourage you to head to our website and apply for one of the travel and accommodation scholarships. You not only get to come to our wonderful conference, it's great in its own right, but you also get a free trip to DC for our policy discussions, for our free political trainings that we conduct during it, and of course, the best part of the conference, the receptions that we hold at the end of the day at some of the best bars and places here in DC. So thank you all again so much for joining, and hopefully it won't be too long before we see you all again. Thanks, and have a good night.